let me start with a fairly reductive and highly debatable schematic of the art world as we tend to think about it. As we tend to think about it from a commercial standpoint, the artist would make an artwork. It would be then brought to the gallerist, who would sell it either to a collector or a museum, perhaps via a fair. The collector, we hope, eventually might donate it to a museum or sell it to a museum, or give it to an auction house, at which point it might be bought by a museum, or might go back to the collector and go back and forth a few times. But anyway, this was obviously this is highly debatable, but this is kind of the mechanism that people think about when they think about how the art world works. Then there's the cultural validation path. A little bit more complex, but you have an artist who's discovered either by a curator or by a gallerist. The curator might bring them to a biennial or to a museum. The gallerist might sell them to a museum or to a collector. At some point after the curator or the gallerist puts them into play, the critics, media, art historians come in. So this is kind of the world as we think about it. And like everything related to the good old times, it wasn't even true then. But I think the case I'm going to make tonight is that it's even less true now. It's a highly complex environment. People are wearing many hats, or they're wearing one hat in a different way than people used to wear them. And I'm going to walk you through relatively fast, because it's a keynote and not a 3-hour lecture, and I'm standing between you and your dinners, which is a dangerous place to be. I'm going to walk you through some of the sort of keynote signature shifts in some of these domains. Let's start where we should always start, which is with the artists. Traditionally, artists were thought of as people who produced works, and that was the role that they played, and their role was to just produce work, and then someone else was supposed to be in charge of distribution, curation, etc. I mean, one of the really interesting things that we're seeing a lot of lately is artists curating biennials. For those of you who did not go to Istanbul, I highly recommend the new Istanbul Biennial from Michael Elmgren and Ingar Dragset, the couple that have worked together for a long time. It's a great biennial. It's, as you all know, a very interesting city at a very interesting moment. And what's interesting about this is how much, when I was speaking with the artists who were in that biennial, the question came up, what is it like to be curated by an artist versus being curated by a curator? And one of the things that they said was that Michael and Ingar had the benefit of having been the frustrated artist being curated by a curator, so they knew what it was like to be on the other side. One of the things that's great about that biennial, for example, is that there are relatively few artists. Like, they haven't flooded the zone with hundreds of artists, so that each artist can actually get the attention that their work deserves. I think it's an interesting dynamic, and it's one that we're going to see, we've seen a lot of, and we'll probably see a lot more of, and I think it's a very different thing when artists do this than when a curator does this. What's interesting is that when I spoke to them, they didn't quite say never again, but they said, I'm really looking forward to getting back in the studio, because it's a very difficult position. Those of us who are in the press, who were in the press, know that it's a very different thing to be the editor and to be the writer. It's a much broader kind of dynamic, but I think it's interesting. Another example of artists doing something that we don't normally think of doing, Yayoi Kusama, the very famous Japanese artist, one of the premier living artists working today, certainly one of the premier artists within the market within Asia, is going to open her own museum in the middle of Tokyo. And I think the idea, I mean, we've just gotten used to the idea that collectors open museums, private collections, and the impact of private collections is something I'll talk about later. But the idea that artists are building their own museums is very, very interesting. And of course, it's a way of guaranteeing that their work will be shown in exactly the way that they want it, which is one of the great frustrations for artists. Moving on and into the market, one of the big, most highly debated articles from this summer was one from the New York Times, in which Robin Pobegren, the writer there, the art market writer there, talked about the way in which the Los Angeles painter Marc Grotjahn controls his market, is very active within his market, is very, very, let's say, is very proactive in terms of how his galleries are selling, who they're selling to, what's happening, whether his artwork is being protected at auction. So this notion that the artist is kind of in a passive position within the market and lets the market do with them what it will is completely out the window. One of the reasons why this article was highly discussed was the fact that the Times wrote about it as a kind of, as a singular thing. And in fact, as Jerry Saltz pointed out, people, and you probably can't see, I highlighted the words Julian Schnabel, Richard Prince, Donald Judd, Richard Serra, and of course Warhol are all people who are actively involved in their markets. But what's interesting about it is that when I talk to young artists, the notion of stepping back from your market is something that they really don't believe in. I see more and more artists who really feel like understanding their markets, working with galleries. I get a lot of questions, should I work with this gallery, should I work with that gallery, how many galleries is too many galleries, should I leave this small gallery and join a big gallery? That the notion that the artist, in order to control their cultural destiny, also has to control their commercial destiny, is one which is becoming more and more prominent, that people are not ashamed of thinking about, and frankly, they're completely right. I personally think that, especially in moments where a lot of galleries are looking for artists coming out of art school, that these kids coming out of school should have some knowledge, some training, some thinking about how they want to deal with this, because if you do it wrong, it really can consume you before you even get started. I think, obviously, I don't think people should be making work just because they think they can sell that style of work. I think one of the sad things that happened in China was that a lot of really interesting painters moved from Hangzhou, which is where the Chinese Arts Academy is, to Beijing, and went from being video artists to being painters because they thought painting was the thing that would sell. And in fact, what's most interesting now is more the conceptual and video work. But the point is, understanding your market doesn't make you a commercial artist. It makes you someone who's in charge of your own destiny, which is what everyone in this room should be, regardless of their industry, so why not artists? Interestingly, after this Grochon article, one of the most amazing things, and after we agreed to do this speech, this came up, this is an Instagram post from Marc Grochon about a piece that Phillips had at auction. It's a screenshot. You can see it's a screenshot because you can see the URL and all of his websites that he saved. And at the bottom, Marc Grochon, the artist, wrote, "Yo, Phillips, DM me, like send me a direct message. I'm not sure I made this. Either way, it sucks." This is the most interventionist thing you can do in your market because the piece got pulled out of the auction. So if you want to talk about controlling your destiny, this is a really good example. Again, Grochon wasn't the first one to do this. He didn't even do it in the most intense way. The most intense example I know of this is what happened a few years ago. There was quite a famous sale that was done at Christie's, and it was called "If I Live Till Tuesday." I'm forgetting the exact title, but the point is, Wade Guyton, who was at the time and still remains one of the hottest artists in the market, had a piece that was in there. And Wade is someone who really doesn't want his work circulating at auction. He wants it in great private collections and he wants it in museums. And what's interesting about Wade is that his pieces are digital prints. They're not paintings. They're prints. And so what he did was he took the image, he took the piece that was in the auction, and he went into the studio and made it much less scarce by printing up, lo and behold, before the auction, 10 or so new versions of this piece. So suddenly this went from being a unique piece to an edition of one, which, by the way, still wasn't enough for it to not sell. But the point is that it was really interesting. And I thought this was a really ballsy and interesting gesture, a really proactive move within the market against the auction houses. But I will say this. We do every year a yearbook. Some of you probably know it. It's 680 pages. It weighs almost 3 kilos. And every year we have a tour d'horizon written by someone within the art world. Chris Durkon actually wrote one for us last year. Harold Falkenberg wrote the first one. I approached Wade and I said, "Wade, would you like to write an essay about this? It's such an interesting thing, the way you reacted to this, the way you tried to take control of this thing within the market." And he turned to me and he said, "Marc," and we've known each other for a while, he said, "Marc, I'm an artist. I want to make art. I don't want to spend any more time talking about the market, which is completely the right reaction. You know, he said, I want to go back to the studio. I don't want this to be the discussion around me. You know, so anyway, those are some examples of the ways in which artists are completely transcending this vision we have of them, starving in a garret until some moment where a gallery comes along and figures out how to sell their work. I mean, I think it's a great example of actualization. It's a great example of being realistic about what's going on out there and trying to drive the career in a way that it's sustainable, that it's interesting, and that they're part of the conversations they want to be part of. Onwards to galleries. There's a term in the market, and I don't know where it comes from because it's not entirely accurate, but it's called the Castelli Model, based upon Leo Castelli, the great gallerist from New York, or not from New York, from Europe, but then who made his greatness in New York. And when people talk about the Castelli Model, what they're talking about is the notion that a gallerist identifies artists early in their career, often from the same generation as them, and then the gallery and the artists grow together. The gallery invests in their museum shows, invests in their careers in different ways, finds collectors for them, sees them through difficult times, goes with them when they get the big MoMA retrospective. And the Castelli model is interesting because what it means in theory is that you have a generation of gallery working with a generation of artists, and then when the next generation of artists come, their generation works with them, and so you have generation upon generation. And of course, at one point, gallerists stop working. Generally, they don't retire. Generally, they're incapacitated in one way or another because a gallery is not really a job. It's not a profession. It's a mission. It's a passion. Every gallerist has the ambition, the intelligence, the social contacts, and the drive to have done something much more lucrative than what they do. So the fact that they do it is because in one way or another they have this incredible passion for art. But the point is, inevitably, like all of us, at some point they stop working. And the theory is that they're then replaced by the leading lights of the previous generation. This is no longer the case. The case now is that young artists who prove to have a record, prove to have momentum, are identified quite early. The most famous example in recent times is Oscar Murillo, the Colombian artist, but who was living in London and had a couple of great shows and then was picked up by David Zwirner, one of the most powerful galleries in the world. It's not entirely unironic that the article I chose is from the Telegraph's luxury section, because obviously this is part of the market going very fast and very big, and Oscar's work, Oscar's work has been something that's been tough to control, partly because so much of it was out there. One of the things that David Zwirner did was to really slow down the production and distribution of his work because the market was so hot, and because Oscar needed time to breathe. But the point is that this is one example among dozens of major established galleries working with artists who are literally a generation or a generation and a half younger than they are. Interestingly, there's a counter trend, which is very young galleries working with much older established artists. You have a great example is Bridget Donahue, who worked for a long time for Gavin Brown's Enterprise and was part of the comeback of Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, an artist from the 70s, video artist who had been basically disappeared. And there's a lot of that. And what's interesting is the shift that you have is one that's from generationally based galleries to psychographically based galleries. In other words, that you have a group of artists of different ages, but within the same kind of register of the same temperament, with the same group of ideas, which actually makes a lot of sense, because realistically, more and more collectors and museum curators are not trying to monopolize one generation. They're trying to get artists that make sense. And it's really interesting in the same way that it's interesting to have artists from all over the world who are working along similar themes. It's also very interesting to have artists from different generations working along similar themes. Speaking of all over the world, this is a graph in which I tried to chart, and I'm updating this all the time because people are opening galleries all the time. And I'm sure I've forgot some people, but these are 9 galleries who all have gallery spaces in more than 3 places. I didn't even put Gagosian on there because they're a league unto themselves. But what's really interesting is that a business in which traditionally our notion, again, our reductive, simplistic, already wrong notion, but our notion was that when you went to a gallery, you could expect to find the gallerist there, right? And that would be the person you'd be having the conversation with. With gallerists doing fairs and traveling and all that kind of stuff, it becomes really different. You know, it becomes really, you're more likely to find the gallerist somewhere else than in their gallery, and it becomes a completely different model. And what's interesting is that all these cities now are tied together by at least one, if not two or three different galleries. I used to have a version of this slide where I had arrows going all over showing how people progressed, and it looked like, you know, the traffic pattern on Friday night at Munich airport. So I decided to do something that was actually a little bit more legible. But what's really interesting is that people are constantly opening. I mean, obviously in Hong Kong, for example, both David Werner and Haus der Kunst have announced that they're going to be moving into a new building that's being built on Queens Road. So two of the most powerful galleries in the world are joining Paste, Gagosian, and Y-Cube, who were already there. So, again, the notion of a gallerist sitting in a gallery selling the artists is completely changed. It's completely different. That's not the reality now. One of the other interesting dimensions is, what is a gallery space now? And the most extreme example I can give is the Haus der Kunst space in Los Angeles. How many of you have been there? Okay, a few. Good. It's a really interesting thing because I'd heard about it, and then I got a chance to tour it when it was, it was really like a hard hat tour. And I heard about the plans. And what was interesting, first of all, was that a major international gallery was opening in Los Angeles, and they weren't opening in Beverly Hills or Westwood. They were opening in downtown LA. And they had taken over an entire former city block. You know, it goes all the way back here. It's a huge former bank building. It has a bookstore. It has a restaurant and an outdoor public sculpture area. It's a lot like a small museum. And I had the interesting experience the last time I was in LA, which was in May, of going around in downtown LA with Noah Horowitz, who's our Director Americas, and we were doing what we do, which is to go out and see as many shows as possible and see who's around. And maybe it was just the day, I think it was like Saturday morning or something, and most of the galleries were quite empty. And I said, wow, is downtown LA just a big hype? Are people really coming to the galleries? When we got to Haus der Kunst, there were hundreds of people. It really has managed to pull together a community of people. Not all of them were collectors. Many of them were not collectors. But the reality is people were coming to the shows, people were coming to the bookstore, people were coming to the restaurant. They have a community garden with chickens. I mean, it's a really interesting dynamic. And it has nothing to do with the classical white cube gallery with a stone-faced person at the desk who doesn't say hi, and the sanctum sanctorum that you're allowed into once you've bought X number of artworks. It also almost certainly doesn't pay for itself. It's part of the positioning of Haus der Kunst on the international stage. It's a gesture which allows them to have a totally different kind of contact with the artists, both who they work with already in LA and potentially could work with in LA. One of the other interesting examples of how the sort of museum world and the gallery world is sort of coming together in a lot of ways is the people the galleries are hiring. This was a surprise move when Thaddeus Ropak, who opened an amazing new space on Dover Street, just off of New Bond Street, in the heart of Mayfair, hired to be one of the leading people there, Julia Peyton-Jones, who for many years was the leader, the co-director of the Serpentine Gallery. And so a lot of us thought, wow, that's a really interesting move. What is someone who doesn't have a history with the market going to do there? And I think the answer, of course, is to pull in ideas, to pull in artists, to bring relationships. It was surprising, but it wasn't as surprising as this, which was when Philippe de Montebello, who was for decades the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, joined Aquavella, a major secondary market dealer, as some sort of external consultant or internal staff. It's not clear what, but the point is the fact that someone whose entire reputation, entire history was running arguably the single most important museum, broad encyclopedic museum in the States and perhaps in the world, would join a secondary market gallery a few blocks away from his former museum was really fascinating. Again, what it points to is the fact that galleries are seeing their role, are seeing the way in which they work, who they want to work with, as very different than they did before. So stepping outside of the gallery world, but stepping to someone who was both a gallerist, Jeffrey Deitch, and then a museum director, and now a gallerist, again, an advisor, you know, there are a lot of different models being played. Jeffrey, for example, is working with Uniqlo to do art in art shops. You know, obviously a completely different thing, much, obviously not elitist at all. It's Uniqlo, where, you know, where we buy T-shirts in a rush at the airport, you know, where, but also people who, a company that does some interesting things. Likewise, another example, UTA, one of the big talent agencies in Hollywood, has set up a gallery called UTA Artists. They're working with artists, they're representing artists. In some ways, the original proposition was that they were going to represent the non-art business of artists, but now they have a gallery. So it's a very unclear kind of equation. I mean, equally interesting is the fact that WME-IMG bought into Frieze, a rival Hollywood agency bought into Frieze, our colleagues in the fair world. And it's interesting to see what's going to happen there, but clearly Hollywood sees something of interest in the art world in a way that they never did before. And you know, maybe they think artists are the new rock stars. Maybe they feel like there are more Steve McQueens out there. Steve McQueen, of course, was a video artist, and quite a good one, before he became an Oscar-winning director. Perhaps the most visibly disruptive and openly brash person in terms of trying to rethink the gallery model is Stefan Simkowitz. There, I just woke all of you up, I hope. Stefan Simkowitz is the son of collectors. He has been, for years, identifying artists in the sort of pre-gallery stage. He bought, if I remember correctly, dozens of Oscar Murillos long before Oscar Murillo went to David Zwirner. He has both sold the work directly to a group of collectors he's built up, but he's also placed artists with galleries. So in some ways, he mediates that relationship to help validate the artists. And obviously, he's gotten a lot of criticism for it. I don't know what the long-term impact will be of these agents, and not all of them are as brash as he is. But I think it's something that has to be studied by gallerists. You have to feel like the fact that someone like Stefan can come into the market and deal with so many young artists at such an early stage means that there's something that needs to be reconsidered within the gallery system. What was interesting was, first he was doing this kind of agenting, and then he set up something called Simcoe's Club, the propositions of which are buying and selling art, artist management, client representation, and logistics, which sounds a lot like a gallery, except that he's not representing artists and he doesn't have a space. So, by the way, he's not alone in this. There are a lot of other people who are coming at it from the other end. People like Anthony Reynolds, for example, who was one of the great London galleries for a long time, shut his doors, continues to do shows in other places, continues to some degree to represent artists. And the question is, what is a gallerist if they don't have a gallery space? Short term, it's a transition phase. Long term, it's a totally new model. It's one of the big conundrums for art fairs such as Art Basel, for whom having an open space and doing regular business in that space and employing people and representing artists is the sine qua non of being eligible to be selected. But at a certain point, you know, if this totally shifts, we'll have to reconsider it. One of the other big things is the financialization of art. You know, this notion of art as an alternative asset class. It's not one that I endorse. I don't want to go into it now because it's a whole other discussion. If you want to talk about it more, you can ask a question, or maybe my colleagues in the front row will grill me about it. But one of the big inflection points for us who are observing the market in this way was when Athena Art Finance, which was backed by the Carlyle Group, and this effort was led by Olivier Sarkozy, the stepbrother of Nicolas Sarkozy, the former French president, announced that they had a fund of, I think it was $500 million, that they would loan against people's artworks. They were only interested in blue chip work, but the idea that you could get significant amounts of money in exchange, you know, by essentially hawking your Basquiat or your Warhol, said that this part of the market, at least, is secure enough that it's a tradable asset class. And what's really interesting are claims, and I don't entirely believe them, that this is an asset class which also can be traded purely via Instagram. I don't really buy that this is happening a lot, but I will say this. There are a lot of art platforms out there purporting to be the next great solution for e-commerce. The reality is the software that sells the most art now is Instagram, and it doesn't even have a buy it now button. The reason is because Instagram is so good at making images viral, and because it's so widely followed, and because you even have this tricky situation where artists are putting the work that they just made in the studio onto their Instagram, and people are trying to buy it from the galleries before the galleries even know that it exists. Like, true story, I know a couple of people this happened to. But what's also interesting about this is that it sort of points to the fact that collectors are doing a lot of research digitally. But curators are also doing a lot of research digitally. I guest edited a package of articles on CNN.com last year, and one of the things that we talked about was the curators to follow, because they were putting their studio visits online, so you could basically track what they were looking at and potentially buy the work or curate it yourself. So that was artists and galleries. Onwards towards fairs. This is an old picture of Art Basel. The people, nowadays, we know that you would get what's called a presentation letter for stacking your works like this. That's not allowed anymore. You know, now the fair should look a little bit more, you know, like this, with proper space between the walls and stuff. But the model of the fair, I mean, this is not a different model of fair. It's just a cleaner model of the fair. You know, I think where it gets interesting, and I'll start with us and then point to some other examples, are when the fair, which was traditionally viewed as a trading platform, where buyers met sellers, and where curators and artists and museum directors weren't necessarily supposed to be spending a lot of time, if any time at all. This started to fall apart a long time ago. This sort of booth-only notion started to fall a long time ago. I think one of the leaders of that was Art Basel when we launched the Unlimited sector. I'm sure almost everyone in this room has been to Unlimited, so you know it allows us to stage huge artworks and also, very importantly, to show video properly, because the economics of showing video in a fair booth are brutal. You have a work which has a very tiny market and which requires a lot of space. I mean, you could sell 25 paintings in the space it would take you to not sell one video. So beyond that, we've also done things like Tempo del Postino, which was a piece that we took over from the Manchester International Festival, an opera of sorts comprised of more than a dozen different artists having their contributing. Likewise, in Miami, we staged Meme for Miami, which was a piece that it was the next extension of something that Ryan McNamara had done for Performa. And this is interesting, but it's more about making our fairs more interesting, broadening it, making it a better place for artists, for curators, for people who aren't buying anything. I mean, people who saw Meme for Miami, people who saw Tempo del Postino may not have bought a work, but I think their notion of what art is and can be was changed by coming to what is ultimately a trade fair. You know, this idea that our mission at the trade fairs is beyond just serving as a trading platform, but also serving as a platform for the exchange of ideas, of contacts, of networks, is one that we embrace, and so do most of the other major international fairs. One of the ways in which we really stepped outside the notion of a traditional fair and outside of our boundaries, which are Hong Kong, Basel, and Miami, was with our crowdfunding project, which we launched a few years ago. Does everybody know what Kickstarter is? Okay. So we did a collaboration with Kickstarter, which allowed us to set up a special section within the Kickstarter website where we would approve projects by nonprofits in the visual arts. So not to fund artists doing projects, not to fund galleries doing projects, but rather to fund nonprofits. And the reason we did that was because we felt like even when the market is hot, the nonprofits often are not getting their due. In fact, a lot of the newer people in the market don't even realize that one exhibition space is a nonprofit and the other space is a gallery. And so the idea that we could both support specific projects and also raise people's understanding and sympathy and support for nonprofits was really interesting to us. What's really interesting about it, though, is the fact that you have no projects in Basel, one project in Miami, one project in Hong Kong. We've helped to fund 64 projects all over the world in places like Kabul, Colombia, Vancouver, Sydney, Lagos. We've helped to raise more than $2 million for 64 projects, and what's interesting about it, is the number of backers, that more than 13,000, which is, I wish there were 13,000 great collectors of art, but reality is that when you've got 13,500 people giving donations, it's way beyond the traditional art collectors and patrons. What it means is that we were able to help people tap into a broader network. I have to say that this was a scary step for us because it was really something different, and we expected and got a fair amount of criticism, but mostly confusion, like why is Art Basel doing this? The notion that we actually believed in supporting the ecosystem that brought artists to the fore, that served as a lab, as an experimentation platform, was something that took people a while to digest. But once they digested it, and because they digested it, we then moved on to launch Art Basel Cities. Now, Art Basel Cities is a project in which we work with we plan to work with individual cities to help do economic development through cultural development. It's not consulting in the sense that our name is on it. Next year in Buenos Aires, which is the first Art Basel Cities, Cecilia Alemani, who's the curator of the Highline, the curator of the fantastic Italian Pavilion last year, will be the first curator of the Art Basel Cities Week. It's not a fair, it will never be a fair. It's not a spearhead for a fair. It's really about trying to do for that city, with that city's financial support, trying to do for that city what we did in places like Miami and Hong Kong, which is to really kind of raise the prominence of the cultural scene, to network it with our international stakeholders, our broader network. And the gamble is that eventually, as in Miami, that it will have an economic payoff for the cities. Again, this is something that people are sort of still wrapping their heads around. I always tell my team, the best thing you can do is focus on the result, and then people will eventually get it. But there's a lot of excitement about it, and we're kicking off an orientation trip in early November. So this is something that's really, it's for real, and of course we're talking to other cities. Another example was us taking Claire McAndrew on with us to work on the art market report. So the idea that an art fair would be the publisher of a market report. Of course, Tefa had worked with her before. What we did is worked with her to actually focus it more on our part of the market and to develop the report some more. But again, when you think about the idea that 10 years ago Art Basel was basically two fairs, you think of all the different developments. And then most recently, and Thomas asked me to include this as well, a week ago, a little more than a week ago, we announced best practices guidelines for our galleries. And it's really about our sense that there was, not within the art world, but in the broader world, a lot of questions about what is the art market, how does it work. There's this ridiculous trope going around that the art market is unregulated. Every transaction in the art market is subject to the same commercial regulations as other commercial transactions. But we felt like it was important to state in detail, in black and white, as part of our exhibition regulations, that how you do business is important in the same way that you doing business is important, that it's not business at all costs, you know? And frankly, we're not doing this because we think we have a problem with a lot of galleries. We're doing this because our concern is that when some antiquities gallery that's never even set foot in Art Basel has a problem with customs, people start taking this big black brush and tarring everyone in our fair with it. So it's really about trying to do what we can, which is limited in fairness, but doing what we can to try to inspire trust and confidence in the market. One of the things we did not do is to do a deal with Adidas. As many of you know, we have a running lawsuit with Adidas about the Adidas Art Basel EQT model, which was launched in Miami last year. For the record, I don't believe in marketing. We don't do baseball hats. We don't do sneakers. We don't do T-shirts. But what was interesting was one analysis of this said, you know, we'll see how the lawsuit plays out. And this was Tim Schneider writing for The Gray Market, which was a really interesting blog I would advise you to subscribe to. He said, isn't it amazing that in 2017, or 2016 actually, in 2016, a major international sneaker company would try to co-opt the reputation and the name not of a rock star or a fashion designer or a cool city, but of a trade fair. It says a lot, you know. We're not alone in doing things in all directions, and I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but, you know, Tefa, for example, which was the definitive Rhineland fair, like the idea that you could do Tefa outside of Tefa, because, you know, you think of Tefa, I mean, I'm sure, who has been to Tefa here? Raise your hands, get some exercise. All right. I mean, Tefa it's so Dutch, you walk in and it's like a corridor of lilies, you know, it's in Maastricht. It's as Rhineland as the Rhineland gets without being actually on the Rhine. But the point is that now you have one Tefa Maastricht fair and two Tefa New York fairs. So, and it's really interesting to see how it plays out. It's a completely different dimension. It's a completely different kind of fair. But clearly people are seeing that the old rules, the old identities are things that have to be constantly reconsidered. Another example, also quite interesting, is the direction that Frieze has gone in. They just did an art and architecture conference last week, just prior to their fair. You know, it's part of Frieze Academy, which is a broader project. They've also extended their sculpture park sector. I mean, it's interesting that everyone is reconsidering the notion of what a fair is and what it can be. And, you know, for instance, this particular event took place during their fair, but they do events all year long. So, again, you know, the fair organizations clearly don't see themselves only as fair organizers anymore. One of the most interesting examples, and I could also have put this with the gallery sector, is Condo. Condo is led by Vanessa Carlos, a great gallerist from the East End, from Carlos Ishikawa Gallery, represents some of the most interesting gallerists of her generation, speaking of the Castelli model. And one of the things that she's done, it started in London and now it's spread, this is in New York, for example, is to set up exchanges where interesting galleries from other places show in the galleries of their peers, so to speak, in other cities. So it's a kind of gallery exchange model. It's really interesting. I think it's super productive. I think it's a great idea. And it's something that gets people into galleries in the same way that Gallery Weekend Berlin in gallery has been super effective. I think it's the strongest event that Berlin does because it leverages the great strength of the Berlin, which is the amazing galleries, the amazing community there. And, you know, I think, you know, when people say, oh, you know, isn't Condo dangerous for Art Basel? I say, no, it's something that gets people into the galleries. It's something which allows the galleries to interact with their community. It's another reason to be in those spaces, and which struggle so much to get the footfall. You know, I mean, one of the things that I should be very clear about is even given the fairs that I lead, and even given the quality of the booths, there's no substitute for seeing work in a gallery. The gallery is the space that was chosen by the gallerist, by the artists. It's the place that they're reacting to. At best, a fair booth is a microcosm or perhaps a solo show. But to really understand a gallery, you have to see the space, the architecture, the neighborhood they've chosen to be in. When galleries shift from neighborhood to neighborhood, it's a really important thing. It's a completely different thing for the galleries to be in West Berlin or in Mitte or along Karl Marx Allee. These are completely different galleries, completely different spaces. It says a lot, and this is actually one of the most interesting part of my jobs, to go to a country I don't know and to visit the galleries that I think I know, and then to discover how they fit, where they fit, what they look like, etc. Next, auction houses. And I'll do this quickly because it's not really my terrain. One of the big disruptors in the auction house world was Philippe Segalot, who, when he was at Christie's in the mid-90s, really helped to lead the notion, or to push forward the notion that you could sell relatively recent work at auction. In the good old days, the notion was that a work had to be at least 10 years old before an auction house would touch it. Under Philippe, it sunk to about 5, and then eventually you had Chinese artists putting work straight into auction. But the idea that the auction house was a place where you sold only the established artists, only the established works, only the people who had stood the test of history, went completely out the window. And you even have cases of auction houses sometimes setting up galleries where they represent artists or they do shows with star curators, etc. There's a lot of playing around and experimentation with the art within the auction world. I think at this particular point, the most experimental auction house is Sothebys, perhaps because they're publicly traded and they have a lot of pressure on them to sort of to grow and develop rapidly. One of the things they did, when was this? Yeah, about a year and a half ago, was to acquire art agency partners, which was comprised, two leaders were Amy Capolazzo, who for a long time had been a leader at Christie's, and then Alan Schwartzman, who was, speaking of shifting roles, first a journalist, and then arguably one of the greatest advisors in the world in terms of the collections that he built up, and now works within the context of an auction house, although not really as an auctioneer in any capacity. But the idea that they would bring in-house an advisory agency and allow that agency to continue working in that way is interesting. Likewise, Art Agency Partners does a pretty interesting blog, and actually I have to admit, a very interesting series of podcasts. So the auction house is not only an auction house and an advisor, but also a media channel. And then even more recently, Christy McClear, a great woman who led the Rauschenberg Foundation for a long time, joined Sothebys with the notion that Sothebys would represent estates. Now, if you follow the upper end of the market, you know that the most powerful galleries at the moment are fighting tooth and nail to take over estate business. Some of the estates are just great names. Some of the estates are still filled with material. But the idea that an auction house would represent an estate rather than a gallery was quite interesting. Next, the museum world, and I'll go through this relatively quickly even though we're in a museum. I think one of the interesting things, as I mentioned before, is the role of private collections. The fact that more and more private collectors, like Ernst Beiler, like Maya Ori at the Schallager, I promise you these won't all be Basel galleries, Basel museums, have decided rather than donating all of their work to a public museum, instead to do something that they have brought more control over and which is more focused on their collection. What's interesting about the Schallager, and I'm sure many of you have been there, is that rather than having all of the work in storage, it's actually installed. So it's a tremendous resource for people, for art historians and other people, because they can actually see works from this amazing collection actually displayed. Going further afield, there's the Museum of Old and New in Tasmania. I think the most eye-opening thing for me, a little bit north, on sort of the north edge of that hemisphere, was when I met Lin Han, Wan Wan Lei, and then the person who's not in here is Michael Zhu Fu Huang. Young collectors. When I met them, I got a tour of this museum, the M. Woods Museum. It's in the middle of 798, which is the Beijing Artist District. And as I talked to them, I realized that they'd opened this museum more or less within a year and a half of starting to buy art. So this notion that the museum is something you open once you've built up this huge collection. You know, if you're Ernst Beiler towards the end of his career, you know, if you're Maya Ori, already one of the great patrons when she opens the Schaulager. But the notion that you would go straight to the private museum, and of course, which has a lot of benefits, you know, because you're not just buying for your collection, you're buying for a museum, is really interesting. And it sort of, I mean, obviously Asia is always faster, that's the old trope, but I mean, it also points to the way in which young collectors not only have gone from not just buying from their region or from their city, but also have immediately gone very international with the notion of building an internationally recognized private collection. It would be remiss of me of course, not to mention the Fondazione Prada, a really, really interesting museum by Rem Koolhaas to the southern end of Milan, which I think has been great for Milan because along with the Hangar Bicocca at the other end of town, it really gives Milan something it doesn't really properly have, which is contemporary art museums, despite the strength of the galleries and artists in Italy. Last but not least, just to say that not everything is going into private collections. We have the M Plus Museum across the harbor from our convention center in Hong Kong, which among other things is awaiting the collection of Uli Sig as soon as it opens a few years from now. You know, Uli, who's a very important figure in the art world, former Chinese ambassador to China for Switzerland, a close friend of mine, Uli really wanted this to go to a public museum because he thought it was important that a public museum have it, the public museum take care of it, and he really wanted it to go somewhere within the broader Chinese environment. So it's not, but the fact is that a major private collection going to a public museum is more the exception. It's not more the exception of the rule, that's overstated, but let's say it was notable because Uli could totally have sold one or two pieces and worked with any of the architects he's very close to and built an amazing collection in Switzerland of Chinese contemporary art. Because what Uli did was basically, at a moment when nobody else was buying, to secure many of the signature pieces of the 90s at a time when nobody else wanted them, where they literally would have disappeared. So he had all the material to do a world-class private collection, but he said, no, it's important that it be in a public museum. So I'm almost done. So, you know, you two need to start warming up, and we're waiting for your questions. So where are we? The reality shift. And here you're going to have to watch and listen closely, because it's going to get rather intense. We start with the traditional commercial path. This is what it looks like now. So we have artists selling to agents, selling to advisors, and sometimes selling to museums and certain to collectors. We have agents going straight to collectors. We have collectors selling to galleries and back and forth, curating shows in galleries. We have the artists selling directly to the auction house. A bad idea, but not unheard of. We have auction houses working with digital platforms. We have gallerists working on digital platforms. We have artists working on digital platforms. We have gallerists, you know, going to advisors who are then sending stuff to museums. So anyway, and you could draw more lines up here. But the point is, however reductive that first slide was, it certainly was not, the reality at that time was certainly not as complex as it is now. Likewise, again, the traditional validation path for artwork, not about commerce, but about building the reputation, now looks something more like this. Notice, and this is not, it's funny, because I was talking to Thomas, he said, I think there's a typo because the font of social media is so much bigger. I was like, no, that's not a typo. That's font, you know, that's information, that's just showing information the right way. Social media is huge, right? So artists are posting things on social media. Collectors are seeing it, sometimes buying. Collectors are posting things on social media. Curators are saying things on social media. Gallerists are posting to social media. Gallerists are selling to advisors, selling to collectors. Often the reputation of the advisor, which advisors are buying an artwork, an artist's artwork, is actually seen as important, you know. the agents are using social media as a way not to have galleries, you know. That was all my arrows, but again, it could be many, many more. So last slide. If you're feeling confused, join the club. Even in my position with all the access to information that I have, I'm constantly, I call this the double PS dilemma, because you don't know if something is a pendulum swing, which is going to swing back, or if it's paradigm shift. And if it's a pendulum swing, you wait for it to swing back. But if it's a paradigm shift, you better get out in front of the wave before it crushes you. So, on that note, I guess it's up to you, Thomas and Silke.
Thank you. That was very interesting. And it was a really concentrated look on what is happening at the time and what is possible. Amazing and scary also a little in terms of shifting roles. And there seem to be almost no boundaries. I want to come back to one point that you talked about already, which I find very interesting. It's the fact that Art Basel recently released regulations for the exhibitors. This is something that I found amazing because many sellers and resellers and collectors and people in the art world find it extremely attractive that there are no regulations in the art market, or almost no regulations in the art market, and that's something that is different from many other markets. So now Art Basel is handing out regulations. So please explain what you want to prevent with this and why you think it is necessary to do that.
Especially if you allow me, Marc, to have another breath. And 12 years ago, Marc wrote about the art market as the last major unregulated market within the art newspaper. Is this what you're coming up now, some sort of counterbalance? I found it very applaudable what it is that you're doing there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting 12 years later to find out that you were wrong. I mean, as I said before, the art market is not unregulated as much as people may say it is. The reality is that it's a commercial transaction subject to all the same commercial transactions, you know, breach of contract, fraud, whatever. All of that stuff falls within under normal commercial law. And Silke, I mean, I think I have to. I'll question a couple of premises from your question, so to speak. I'll question the premise. So basically, the first thing is, when it comes to the way that gallerists do business, we didn't hand down regulations. We wrote out guidelines of what we see as a best practice. And if this is of interest to you, I would strongly encourage you not only to read the articles, but also to read the actual guidelines. I mean, the best practices guidelines is less than 700 words. And it's very basic. It's things like pay your artists, issue invoices with information, pay your consigners, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is not an onerous regulation. It's not a regulation at all. What it is our attempt to lay down for the first time a code of practice that more or less already fits the modus operandi for almost every gallery we do business with. The other thing I'll say is, I think there are many more collectors who would like to operate within a stable and trustworthy market than one which is lawless. I think given the sums invested and the belief that people have in the artists and the relationship they have with the galleries, you know, I've gotten a lot of messages from collectors saying, wow, this is great, you know. Likewise, I've gotten a lot of messages from gallerists saying this is great, it's a real step forward for the market, it's something that was necessary to do. And then to answer the last part of your question, why did we feel this was necessary? We thought it was necessary because time and time again, we'd seen cases where a legal issue or an investigative story, or even just a lawsuit between two private parties, one of them a gallery and another one a collector or an artist or another gallery, for example, was used as a way to tar the whole system. You know, and I think the reality is this. People who don't buy art don't understand why other people buy art. And I think the notion that you're buying it because you find art inspiring, because you think it adds something to your life, because you'd rather put your money into art than into yachts, doesn't wash with them. So they're always looking for an ulterior motive. They're always looking askance at this. And I think what we wanted to say, and our powers are limited. You know, we don't have any insight on the actual transactions. You know, the only thing we can control is the admission and presence of galleries into our system. We don't, you know, we can't control transactions. We don't know what people are transacting. We can't control collectors. We can't control artists, you know. But what we did, just, you know, for the benefit of the audience, was to draft 2 sections. The first section is the best practices. It's guidelines. When it's felt that galleries are not operating within best practices, i.e., I mean, most egregiously not paying their artists, that information will be referred to the selection committees, who will treat that as part of all the information they're looking at. The real innovation, so to speak, because best practices exist within the context of many countries' national gallery associations. You know, the ADAA has a code of ethics that's been around for at least 10 years. I don't happen to know the German system. I know the French Gallery Association has a very extensive system, for example, including transactions between galleries. Where there's a real innovation, and it was really important, is we said, what happens if a gallery is indicted by their government? Indictment being the US term, and there are different legal systems. What happens if your national government has decided that you've committed a crime involving your gallery's activities? And that's a pretty serious thing, to have an exhibitor under that kind of indictment. So we said, rather than expecting our gallerists, who are just gallerists, the members of the selection committee are gallerists, we hire them because we think they have a good reputation, because they're intelligent, because they're articulate, because they can lose the selection round without feeling, without going into a sulk. We don't hire them for their legal knowledge. We don't hire them for their knowledge of foreign legal systems 7 time zones away. So we said, in cases like this, the potential reputational damage to other exhibitors and to the market in general, and of course to Art Basel by extension, should be examined by legal experts. And so that's what's completely new about this. What's completely new is that we're not expecting our gallerists to judge legal cases that have pushed past investigation and into actually the gallery having to go to court and defend itself with huge risks on the line.
Yeah, it's
You
wow.
asked, listen, do you want to get into legal cases? I'm going to get legalistic with you.
I still can't believe that pay your artist is an advice that somebody has to give a gallerist.
You know, it's really one of the saddest things for me is when galleries go out of business, because so often the people left holding the biggest bag are the artists. Generally speaking, I've had the displeasure of seeing the bankruptcy documents of a few galleries, and generally speaking, the insurance company got paid, the landlord got paid, the art freight handlers got paid. If someone didn't get paid, it's the artists. And good galleries pay their artists as soon as the transaction comes through. And if they can't pay their artists and pay their rent, they go out of business before leaving their artists, leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars on unpaid debts. Because artists, let's face it, being an artist is not a garret and some paintbrushes. It's staff, it's production costs, it's studio assistants. So I think pay your artists is like when people say, like how do I be a good gallery? My first thing is pay your artists, and I wish it wasn't something that you would have to point out or underline, but the fact is, it is. And likewise, there's a lot of cases where consigners don't realize the work has been sold until they see it hanging on someone else's wall. And when I say a lot of cases, I mean enough to count on one hand, which means that it's 0.0000001% of all the transactions that month. But it happens, and it shouldn't happen.
When you spoke about the galleries, you said that a gallery would also be a good advisor to artists because they tell them when it is time to leave their studio and really show the work. Sometimes it seems that, you know, what the galleries are doing is there's a lot of shows that have been going on in New York and other where it's like 30 artists under 25, 20 artists at the age of 20. You know, the late Arthur Dento, Columbia professor of art, said that many artists are in there for the fame, and they oftentimes only define themselves by, by having had their first gallery show. We're in Germany, so I'm going to quote Nietzsche only once, but he said in order to be a lightning, you have to be a cloud for a long time. Yeah. And my question is, do you see that as an issue that galleries are churning out artists all too quickly? You know, you see art that is being produced for art fairs, more or less. It still smells of oil if you can smell an artwork. Do you see that happening, and what would be your advice in that regard?
I mean, regardless of your career, speed is always a danger, you know, and early fame is often a trap. I think, I mean, actually, this is kind of the wrong moment to talk about that topic. It was much more relevant 3 years ago. What we're seeing right now is people discovering women artists in their 70s and 80s and bringing them to the fame they should have had 50 years ago. You know, but I mean, you know, that being said, I think,
just for the rapid, I thought I should throw something in there. You know.
No, I mean, I think what's interesting is that this kind of high-speed market is not a danger for great artists because they have the character, they have the singularity, they have the unique vision to withstand it. It's not a danger for bad artists because bad artists are going to be bad artists anyway, regardless of the market they're in. It's not going to make them worse than they were. You know, it's a danger for good artists. It's a danger for artists who practice is not fixed enough to be dragged into the spotlight at such an early age. You know, and I would say that there are a great many artists, and historically, you know, a lot of the Castelli artists, he showed some artists for the first time when they were in their early 20s and some in their early 40s. I forget. I'm sure I'm wrong about this, but it's generally right. I think Barnett Newman, for example, had his first solo show when he was in his 40s, you know? And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think, I mean, it's interesting, you know, it was an interesting dilemma for us, for example, and I don't want to get too art fair geeky on you, but like one of the things that we changed a while ago was this rule that for the young sectors of our fair, statements in Basel, positions in Miami, discoveries in Hong Kong, we didn't want artists who'd had a museum solo show because people were getting solo shows, museum solo shows, 2 or 3 years out of art school. And we just said, you know, if we make that a regulation, half the great artists of that early generation are technically disqualified. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, good.
Silke?
I'd like to talk a bit about collectors. I've heard from several gallerists that the collectors the art collector has changed during the last decades from somebody who liked to spend a lot of time with art and to see the art world or art pieces or artists as something from another world that parallels his business world maybe, and that is something else for him. Right. And now we have this younger collectors pacing through the art fair. They used to spend maybe 2 days, and now they are only half a day there, or I don't know, but they are not very concentrated, and they have their handheld and their mobile phone in hand, and they don't, not to say it's good or bad, but it's different. So how can a fair react to this changing collectors?
I mean, there's actually a lot of different layers to your question, so I'll try to unpack them one at a time, and if I miss something, just call me on it. The first thing I would say is there's an unquestionable paradigm shift in terms of who has wealth now. The super wealthy now are not the inheritors. The inheritors are actually behind the people who make money in tech, in finance, in other fields. And those people are very, very busy. So it's not that the people who used to go to galleries and buy lots of art are no longer going to galleries. It's that the people who are buying lots of art don't necessarily have the time to buy the galleries, to really explore galleries. I will say, though, that you know, people talk a lot about fair fatigue. You asked me about this before. You know, I think, and when people talk about fair fatigue, they talk about collectors as if they were one homogeneous group. The reality is that fair fatigue is something that can happen, doesn't always, can happen to collectors at a certain stage in their trajectory. When they start, they don't know a lot of galleries, they don't know a lot of artists, they're trying to educate themselves quickly. For better or for worse, art fairs are one of the great places to get to know a lot of galleries, a lot of artists, to take a tour d'horizon and decide where, I feel, you should be spending your time, which galleries you want to follow, which artists you want to follow. Now, at a certain point, you've decided what your collection is going to be, you're being inundated by JPEGs, maybe you don't have any more room in your storage, you're trying to decide what goes next with your collection, and you stop going to 10 fairs a year because you've been to those places, and you start going to the 2 or 3 fairs that really matter to you. You know, and usually they're fairs that also are in cities that are of interest to you, either personally or, I mean personally, like your personal life or your personal collecting life. So that being said, the great challenge for us as fair organizers, whose job it is to try to make our gallerists successful, not just during our fairs, but all year long, our great challenge is how do we continue to bring the excited collectors, the unfatigued collectors, how do we bring the energetic, fresh-eyed, highly motivated collectors, and you know, one of the things we've done is vastly expanded our VIP relations network so that we have people in 30 different places who are actively identifying new collectors, but also actively promoting the fairs to the collectors who don't go to 10 fairs a year, who don't just say, oh, I'm going to Art Basel because it's Art Basel. It's like, well, what's going on this year? Why should I go? And you have to give them a reason, you know? I feel like I only hit 2 out of the 4 levels of your question. What did I forget?
Yeah, how do you do it?
Oh, you know, I think the content is king. I think by pushing our galleries to bring the best booths possible, by rejuvenating, by bringing in young galleries, by having special sectors, by putting together amazing talks. I mean, one of the most amazing, if you're interested in race relations in America, for example, you know, there's an amazing conversation between Glenn Ligon, who's one of the most interesting black artists, and Claudia Rankine, who's an amazing poet and scholar at Yale University, about the interaction between art and poetry and race in America. You know, and I think this kinds of thing where you really have, or like a very weird talk between Chris Durkan and Richard Tuttle, which has turned out to be all about Indonesian tapestry, because that's Richard Tuttle's great passion. You know, things like this, you know, great events, great, you know, encouraging and promoting great shows in the cities. These are the things, you know, when you think about the fair, not just as, you know, 12 to 8 in the convention center, but dusk till dawn for an entire week in a city, that's when I think you create the kind of experience that draws people, that activates people who might otherwise feel fatigued about fairs.
I feel so in depth. You know, the audience is here with so many gallerists and artists and museum directors. I feel like we should open this up soon. But I have 2 more real selfish questions that I want to ask you. And maybe Silke throw in another one. Quick answers, quick questions. The one is just 2 days ago in the financial section, in the money section of the Financial Times, there was a talk about if you value, you know, how artist prices are going up. We all know it's a $60 billion business. If you value that against investable assets, like the gold standard or how certain stocks are doing, apart from the auction record-setting prices, the art is not doing that great in terms of that the collector is often left with what they call a dividend of pleasure that has to be there and not only look at art as an investment. What do you tell collectors in that regard?
I think I'd rather have a great bacon in my living room than some gold bullion. I mean, you know, if you buy art you love and you live with it, even if it doesn't appreciate in value, you're basically, and then you sell it and you get it for free. In the worst case, it loses value and you're paying a marginal rent on it. I mean, I think you can make money investing in art, but you have to have really good information and really deep pockets and a really high appetite for risk. You know, most people buying money in art, most people investing, and there's a difference between investing and spending money wisely. You know, people should understand the market, so there are trade-offs. You know, maybe you're more interested in a Beuys than a Peter Doig, and they're more or less the same price. You know, and I like both artists, but you know, like the value of a major historical artist is higher than the value of a very hot contemporary artist. You know, the joke is that contemporary art is always overpriced because, you know, over the course of history, almost all of those artists will become forgotten. I mean, in centuries, not in years. But the point is, if you buy contemporary art that you love and you can afford it and you live with it, then you've made a good investment. You know, I think, you know, you only live once. I mean, hedonic payoff is the best payoff.
I wonder what your take is, because we are in Germany, we are in Munich. Munich lost a lot of galleries, you know, going to Berlin, for example. You mentioned the gallery weekend that we are also happening to be partnering with. But what is your, I mean, just now, MCH, the mother company of Art Basel, they bought into more, let's say, local fairs. They bought a stake in Düsseldorf at the same time that Art Berlin started, surpassing Art Berlin Contemporary, which was not labeled a fair. All these things are happening in terms of rapid shift and changing roles this year in Germany. What is your take on the healthiness? Of course, you have the Art Cologne as well, the standard of health when it comes to the art market in Germany.
I mean, first of all, both of you could probably answer that question in better detail than I can, but I'll try anyway. Because I'm on the hot seat, you know, and I can't get off stage but you know, without running past one of my friends. I think if there's any country in the world that can support several regional fairs, it's Germany. There's no country in the world where you have a broader, deeper group of collectors, where people who have even a minimum of wealth are expected to support culture in one way or another. So, I mean, you know, all these fairs will succeed or not succeed based upon execution. You know, they will. The question will be, how good are they at bringing new collectors? How good are they at serving the galleries? How good are they at working with their communities? You know, but these are, as I said, you know, the Rhineland is so dense with collectors that the idea that two fairs at different times of year can't succeed, to me, seems, assuming that they're properly executed, seems unreasonable. And certainly Berlin, I think, is at the beginning of a very long arc in terms of its place to be a fair. You know, it's a great place for galleries. It's a great place for artists. It has a burgeoning tech and finance scene, which will lead off, which will, you know, bring collectors. Again, I mean, I think it's far too early to say. I generally don't like speculation in the art market. I don't like speculating about the art market.
I have one more question. Okay? Yeah?
Yeah, sure.
As Art Basel, to keep your leading role, you really cannot miss any new development in the arts. You have to represent new things happening in the studios of the artists.
Right.
Many of the representatives of that kind of art are young galleries with a small budget, and once they manage to be part of Art Basel, it's a great thing. It's like probably a very important point of their career, but sometimes it can be very demanding to keep the pace and to stay on the carousel, so to say.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there are strategies to endorse this and to.
Sure. I mean, this is one of the big. It's one of the big public discussions. I mean, obviously, in some ways, actually, it's probably harder right now to be a mid-career gallerist with mid-career artists than to be a young gallerist with young artists, because the expectations are higher, the costs are higher, and the competition is tougher for your lead artist. But to get back to the young galleries, about 5 years ago, we started looking at this question, and we made a couple of decisions. One was the one I mentioned before, of saying, you know, it was okay if an artist had already had a museum solo show. The other thing we said is, it's okay if this artist has already appeared in one of our fairs or in one of our competitor fairs, as long as it's a new body of work. Because we didn't want people to experience this phenomenon we were hearing about, where people would show their 3 or 4 best young artists, then they didn't have great young artists, then they didn't get into our fairs, and then their great young artists would jump to other galleries because they weren't getting into fairs. So we said, you know, let's do everything we can to allow people to grow with those artists. The other thing we did, you know, and it doesn't sound like much, but it was important for these galleries, is that we significantly dropped, like 15 or 20%, the price of participating in those young sectors. In addition to which, you know, great example, you know, along, you know, in this case, you know, with BMW, we helped to create, we partnered on this BMW Art Journey, which is specifically targeted towards supporting the dreams of younger artists, the fantasy projects, the amazing projects. So this is something that we try to do, and frankly, as a sort of kitchen cabinet advisor to galleries, when they ask me, I say, don't do too many fairs. Yes, you're the hot young thing in Prague, on the Lower East Side, in wherever, in Sao Paulo, but get your gallery straight, get your business straight, learn how to run the business, protect the 2 or 3 artists who are the core of your program. Stabilize your business before you start joining this kind of traveling caravan. Questions from the audience? Don't be shy. We have microphones. Wow. For the record, the Swiss are less shy than the people of Munich, which is amazingly shy. Okay, there we go. You better be from Munich, that's all I'm going to know.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this very insightful talk, keynote. I just wanted to ask if you could maybe elaborate on the role of social media in this whole thing, because the examples you were giving with artists like Gaiten and Grotjan were quite interesting, but these are quite established artists. Also, like maybe about the potential of how other people in other positions could use it, or like, I don't know, institutions and stuff like that also, or emerging artists, or I don't know.
I mean, that's a whole other topic, and I'm happy to explore it. But if you're really interested, I did a talk at Bocconi in Milan, where I'm a visiting professor, which was specifically me talking with 4 gallerists about social media and how they worked with it and how their artists could work with it. It's on my LinkedIn page if you're curious. But I'll try to answer the question quickly. I mean, I think there's a broad range of things. There are artists who use social media as a medium, like Amalia Ullmann, most famously, who did this long, semi-fictional piece that really dealt with the issues. Yeah, I know we're supposed to finish. It's okay, but we're getting questions from the audience, so we're going to ignore you. Sorry. Anyway, but I mean, I think obviously social media is most valuable as a promotional tool. And it's just as powerful, and maybe more powerful for artists who don't have galleries, who don't have markets, than for those who do, because it's free, and it's highly viral. And I just read an article in the New York Times the other day about an artist who's fully supporting himself by putting things on Instagram and getting direct messaged from people who want to buy it. I think understanding how to use it is a really important, although not obligatory, skill. I mean, one of the most interesting young galleries in New York, 47 Canal, just doesn't use social media at all. For the record, Norga Rimschneider still doesn't have anything approaching a functional. It's a deliberately punk rock, non-functional website, and yet they run a great gallery showing amazing artists. So it's not the future, it's a future. And I think you have to think about whether it suits your purposes, your gallery's purposes, your career, et cetera. It helps if you make square, flat art, It gets a little trickier if what you do is long performances or video art or complicated sculpture and installations. But I mean, I think, as with anybody in this room in any industry, like understanding what other people are doing in social media and how you might adapt it for your goal, which by the way should not be to be a social media star, but rather to be a leader in your industry using social media, is a really interesting tactic. Whatever you do, just don't ape the Kardashians, okay? Effective as it may be. Another question?
Thank you.
Come on, now that I've shot down the guys trying to wave us off. All right, one more. When the BMW senior management tells me I need to go, I'll go.
I think I also have to break the ice for the Munich audience for being daring, asking questions. I'd be interested. I mean, you've talked about the guidelines you've issued. Yeah. I would say it's like a code of conduct or for the exhibitors. How do you monitor these, and are there any sanctions for any breaches of such guidelines? Or, I mean, what does it really mean? I mean, obviously you can tell that I'm a lawyer, but how do you impose these guidelines on the exhibitors? And as said, how do you monitor and I mean, are there any sanctions on any breaches, or is it just?
Sure. I mean, we've talked a lot about this, so I'll try to make it short. But Basically, again, the best practices portion of the guidelines are guidelines. They're not regulatory. There's no binary thing about it. It's basically saying this is one notion that we feel is globally applicable of how you can and should do business. If people are egregiously out of bounds, then obviously, and we hear about it, we'll refer it. Because I've had cases long ago where, I heard after the fact that a gallery wasn't paying their artists, and it would have been nice to know that rather than continuing to support a gallery that wasn't paying their artists over a gallery that was paying their artists. The enforcement mechanism comes into play when you have, and here I'll get legalistic with the lawyer, a case that falls under criminal law under Swiss law, because we have to have one absolute rule for all countries. So it has to fall under criminal law, it has to apparently be intentional, it has to have passed the investigation stage, it has to involve directly the gallery business, so this is not personal business issues. Then there's a legal compliance board which has to decide it meets the criteria. Then a panel is set up relative to each case, which then makes a recommendation, having both examined the facts of the case and having heard the gallery's rebuttal. They make a recommendation, and ultimately it's our decision, because it's our decision about knowing the case, having had the advice of the legal compliance panel, whether or not it would be unjust to take the gallery out of the fair for the moment, potentially, or whether we should wait and see how the trial plays out, or whether this is simply not a case that has that kind of reputational damage. We're not judging guilt and innocence. We're not turning into the FBI or Interpol or International Courts of Justice. What we're trying to do is determine in a fair and coherent and comprehensive way the facts of the case so we can understand whether someone who actually understands the case could feel that it's damaging to Art Basel's exhibitors for them to be present in the fair. As you can tell, I almost went to law school, although I'm happy I didn't, nothing personal.
You said coherent and competent, that's how we want the night to go. This has been blinking time over for the past 20 minutes. As Marc said, and as Marc said at the very beginning, we're the people standing between you and the dinner. We're all certainly inviting you to have dinner or hors d'oeuvre with us outside. It's fantastic that you came. Marc, I have to thank you. Silke, I have to thank you for coming here and for being with us.